Breaking headlines. A small landlocked nation signs a deal so big it shakes the balance of power in West Africa. 1.2 billion. Fleets of tractors, and India stepping into the Sahel, while Washington and Paris quietly grind their teeth. But what if this isn't about farming at all? What if it's a play for sovereignty, for dignity, and maybe the final proof that Africa no longer waits for permission? And here's the irony. The same West that called Africa dependent is now panicking that it may depend on Africa's fields. Before we continue, let me ask you this. Where are you watching from today? America, Africa, or Europe? Drop it in the comments and tell us. If your government had $1.2 billion to spend, would you choose tractors or something else? Welcome to Africa Daily Good News. This channel is built to give you the stories mainstream outlets ignore, but told straight and sharp, connecting Africa's rise with the choices that matter to you, whether you're in New York, Lagos, or Paris. So stay with us, lean in, and let's get started. It is not every day that a nation dismissed as fragile announces a deal worth more than its entire annual budget. Yet in Ouagadougou, that is exactly what happened. On a humid morning, Burkina Faso signed a $1.2 billion agricultural agreement with India, and suddenly, tractors, not tanks, became the symbol of sovereignty. The contradiction was striking. In a region defined by coups and conflict, the loudest sound was not gunfire, but applause echoing through a government hall. The numbers alone jolted analysts. $1.2 billion flowing into a landlocked country, often reduced in headlines to instability and poverty. For decades, Burkina Faso was known more for gold smuggling and security struggles than for agriculture. And now, with a single announcement, it leapt into the league of Africa's biggest agricultural investors. Some wondered aloud, how can a state battling insurgents and budget constraints afford such ambition? But others asked a sharper question. How long can the world keep underestimating a nation that chooses food before fear? On the streets, the story felt less like economics and more like liberation. Supporters waved flags, teenagers posted memes of tractors like they were fighter jets, and farmers spoke of dignity finally being measured in harvests instead of handouts. It is a familiar human shift. When people sense they are no longer begging, they stand taller. And maybe you felt that yourself, when a single change at work or at home suddenly reshaped how others looked at you. Americans often talk about the moment they move from renting to buying a first house. For Burkinabe families, a tractor in the village carried that same weight of pride. Yet beneath the cheers there was unease. Neighboring capitals quietly worried. If Burkina Faso can mechanize quickly, what happens to their own food imports and fragile trade balances? And in Washington or Paris, the questions grew sharper. Why India? Why now? Why would a country the West wrote off as dependent choose New Delhi instead of Brussels? Every answer seemed to point to the same uncomfortable twist. Sovereignty is not gifted. It is taken. One trader in Ouagadougou told a story that spread fast online. He remembered his father, who spent weeks digging fields with wooden tools, only to harvest just enough for survival. "My father died tired," he said, "but maybe my son will live proud." That sentence captured what no statistic could. A tractor is more than steel. It is a promise that effort might finally equal reward. And if human beings can believe that their work matters, they fight less to escape and more to build. This was only the first wave of reaction, but it already hinted at a deeper shift. The applause in the capital carried a signal, one that would soon ripple beyond borders and force others to recalculate what Burkina Faso's rise might mean. And from here, the story only grows more complicated. It is almost absurd to think that a fleet of tractors could unsettle foreign ministries thousands of miles away. Yet that is precisely what happened. The moment Burkina Faso's $1.2 billion deal with India was announced, Western outlets scrambled to frame it as unexpected, while neighboring states quietly calculated what it meant for their food supply lines. And in the background, Washington and Paris asked a question they never thought they'd ask about Ouagadougou. Are we losing ground here too? The reactions revealed a deep contradiction. On one hand, Western analysts warned that Burkina Faso might not have the capacity to absorb such a massive package. On the other hand, The very scale of the deal proved that Africa was no longer waiting for permission. It is the same paradox Americans sometimes face in daily life. When someone says you are not ready for responsibility, but the only way to prove them wrong is to actually take it. After all, how do you measure readiness if not by action? Inside the region, unease was palpable. Countries long dependent on imported food wondered whether Burkina Faso's mechanization would tilt trade flows toward Ouagadougou. A minister in a neighboring capital admitted off-record, "If they succeed, our markets collapse." That fear was less about economics than about pride. People everywhere, whether in Africa or America, dislike watching a rival suddenly leap ahead. It reminds us how fragile the idea of stability really is. For ordinary Burkinabe citizens, the contrast was even starker. Farmers who had spent generations tied to wooden tools now spoke of futures where their children might operate machines, not just bend under the sun. Imagine an American family shifting from paycheck to paycheck jobs to suddenly owning a small business. The psychological lift is not just about income, but about control. Human beings, if given the chance to control their own tools, almost always change how they see themselves. A short story made this real. In one rural district, a young man named Salifu told reporters he had once considered migrating to Europe because there was no future in the soil. After hearing about the Indian tractors, he paused. "If machines come here," he said, "maybe I stay, maybe I build." That hesitation, that tiny change of heart mattered more than the financial spreadsheets. It showed how hope, when tied to concrete tools, can anchor people where despair once pushed them away. And so the scene grew more layered. Analysts abroad dismissed, neighbors worried, citizens celebrated, and a few young men quietly changed their minds about leaving home. The news was about tractors, yes, but the story was about people. That duality, cold statistics clashing with warm human choices, turned a simple deal into something heavier. And as the world digested this contradiction, the next wave of questions was already rising, pointing not only to the soil of Burkina Faso, but to the larger battlefield of influence across the Sahel. Why would a government under constant security pressure choose to pour $1.2 billion into tractors instead of tanks? At first glance, the decision looks reckless, even naive. Yet this very contradiction is what makes Burkina Faso's deal with India so disruptive. It turns the logic of survival upside down. In a region where nations are expected to buy weapons, Ouagadougou chose plows. And that choice may prove more dangerous to old power structures than any missile. The explanation lies in agriculture itself. Over 70% of Burkinabe people depend on farming for survival, but generations were chained to wooden plows and hand tools. The result was predictable. Families worked acre after acre only to produce just enough to eat. Scarcity became a way of life, and food imports became permanent policy. Now, with fleets of Indian tractors on the way, that cycle of dependency faces its first serious challenge. If land that once took weeks to clear can be prepared in a single day, the math of survival changes. And when the math changes, so does the politics. There is a subtle truth here. Human beings, if given even a small tool that multiplies their capacity, will alter not just what they do, but how they see themselves. Many Americans know this feeling. Think of the moment you first held a smartphone that allowed you to work, shop, and connect instantly. It wasn't just a gadget, it reshaped daily habits. In the same way, a tractor in Burkina Faso is not only metal, it is dignity on wheels. Still, critics raise doubts. Can machines alone transform a country where roads are broken, corruption lingers, and insurgents lurk in the countryside? They argue that tractors could rust in village squares like so many failed development projects of the past. But supporters counter with another question. If the alternative is permanent dependence on foreign imports, isn't the gamble worth taking? After all, most breakthroughs in history began as risks dismissed by skeptics. A farmer named Mariam put it more simply when speaking to a local journalist. She recalled her childhood when every planting season meant weeks of exhaustion and prayers for rain that might arrive too late. "We worked like slaves to the soil," she said, "but the soil never worked for us." For her, the arrival of tractors is not about luxury. It is about finally forcing the land to respond to human effort. That shift, from begging the earth to managing it, marks the beginning of sovereignty at the most intimate level. This is why the deal resonates far beyond economics. It represents a break in habit, a refusal to keep repeating the same cycle of scarcity. And as more Burkinabe imagine futures where their children operate machines instead of wielding hoes, the atmosphere changes. Hope begins to look less like a slogan and more like a daily routine. If you're following this story, ask yourself, in your own life, what tool or what decision once multiplied your capacity and made you rethink what was possible? For some, it's a job promotion. For others, it's buying a first car. In Burkina Faso, it might just be a tractor. And while these machines have yet to touch every field, the idea they carry has already spread. It is the image of a people who, for the first time in decades, can imagine breaking free from the weight of subsistence. That image now sets the stage for something even larger, a development that moves beyond farms and into the deeper game of influence. What if the real battlefield in Africa is not in the deserts or the gold mines, but in the soil itself? That is the unsettling thought rising in Western capitals as India plants its flag in Burkina Faso, not with soldiers, but with tractors. While France built military bases and China built roads, New Delhi chose food. And in a continent where hunger has long been used as leverage, food might prove the sharpest weapon of all. The strategy is deliberate. By anchoring its influence in agriculture, India taps into the daily lives of Burkinabe families in ways that tanks or highways never could. The $1.2 billion deal is not just about equipment. It is about embedding training centers, repair hubs, and financing networks. This approach rewrites the script of foreign involvement. Instead of aid programs with strings attached, it looks like co-investment in survival. And that subtle shift makes it harder for critics to dismiss. Still, contradictions abound. For decades, the Sahel was treated as a zone of instability where food insecurity justified endless dependency on imports. Now, with one deal, Burkina Faso positions itself as a potential breadbasket. If the tractors deliver, the country could export wheat and rice across the Sahel, undercutting markets that once saw it as a buyer, not a seller. That inversion unsettles not only governments in the region, but also those far away who benefited from Africa's dependency. The human layer is what makes this story powerful. Think of it this way. Most Americans rarely wonder if their grocery store will have bread tomorrow. Abundance is assumed. But in Burkina Faso, entire communities lived with the opposite expectation. Scarcity was normal, abundance was fantasy. Imagine the psychological shift when families start to believe they can not only feed themselves but also sell to others. Human beings, if they move from surviving to providing, often change their entire sense of identity. A small anecdote illustrates the point. In a village outside Koudougou, an elder farmer recalled how, during the drought of 2012, his family survived on handouts of imported rice. "We ate," he said, "but we ate someone else's mercy." Now, as his village awaits the arrival of new machines, he wonders if the next generation will finally eat their own harvests. That reflection carries more weight than any government statement. It shows the transition from dependence to dignity, from consuming to producing. This is why the geopolitical angle cannot be ignored. If Burkina Faso proves it can harness mechanization to feed its people and neighbors, it sets a precedent. Other Sahel nations, Mali, Niger, Chad, are watching closely. And in the wider chessboard, Washington, Paris, and Brussels face a dilemma. How do you compete with a partner that offers not weapons or loans, but food sovereignty? The answer is not clear, but the question itself signals a profound shift. The soil of Burkina Faso, long overlooked, now becomes a stage where global strategies collide. And as the tractors prepare to roll, the implications stretch far beyond harvests, into the realm of influence where power is measured not by bombs, but by bread. What unsettles old powers is not the tractors themselves, but the speeches that follow them. When Ibrahim Traoré stands before his people and declares, "We are no longer beggars at the gates," the words sting more than any policy paper. Because in that moment, agriculture turns into politics, and farming becomes a stage for sovereignty. The paradox is clear. A country once defined by dependency now uses seeds and soil as symbols of independence. The numbers back this symbolism. With 6,000 tons of wheat targeted for the 2025-26 harvest, Burkina Faso is setting goals that would have been unthinkable only a few years ago. The announcement of agro-processing factories from tomato plants to wheat mills shows a government determined not only to grow crops, but to keep value inside its borders. Analysts who once dismissed such ambitions now admit the model could work if managed carefully. Yet in the same breath, critics whisper that corruption, distribution, and logistics might still choke the promise. And here lies the hidden twist. Doubt itself may fuel momentum. People who are told they cannot often push harder just to prove the opposite. Americans know this well. Think of how Silicon Valley was born from garage startups everyone mocked at first. Most observers laughed until those ideas reshaped the world. The same pattern may be unfolding in Ouagadougou, where tractors are being mocked by skeptics even as they become memes of national pride. For citizens, the shift is personal. Many Burkinabe once considered agriculture a last resort, the work left for those with no choice. Now it begins to carry prestige. A young graduate might once have dreamed only of leaving for Paris. Today, some imagine operating machines, managing cooperatives, or running service hubs tied to India's training programs. Human beings, when they see dignity in their work, change not just their income, but their identity. And that change spreads quietly, reshaping communities from the inside. One story captures this transformation. A woman named Awa, who used to sell imported rice in a crowded market, said she feared every time global prices jumped, because she knew families would buy less and her stall would empty. After the announcement of the India deal, she told a journalist, "If our own fields give us rice, my stall will still be full, but this time the bags will say Burkina." That small shift, selling food grown at home instead of food bought from abroad, felt to her like the difference between survival and ownership. Moments like these show why the tractor deal is not just about economics. It touches status, self-image, and even the rhythm of migration. If young people can see a future without leaving, the demographic tide begins to turn. And as these subtle shifts stack one upon another, the meaning of power in West Africa also begins to tilt. The soil is no longer just soil. It becomes a mirror, reflecting who controls tomorrow. It almost feels unreal. A country that once begged for food aid is now negotiating billion-dollar partnerships to feed itself and maybe its neighbors. That reversal is not just unusual, it is jarring. For decades, the story of Burkina Faso was told through the language of weakness. Now, the very same soil once seen as barren is recast as leverage in a geopolitical game. The contradiction forces everyone, friends and rivals alike, to reconsider what power looks like in West Africa. At the core of this transformation is a philosophical shift. Development was long measured by how much aid arrived from the West. But this deal with India flips the lens. Instead of aid, it is investment. Instead of dependency, it is partnership. And instead of reforms written in Washington, it is decisions taken in Ouagadougou. That shift in agency might be harder to quantify than tons of wheat, but in the long run, it could prove more valuable. Because when people believe they can choose their own partners, they start believing they can also choose their own destiny. Skeptics argue the risks are enormous. A $1.2 billion package is a heavy burden for a fragile state, and tractors alone cannot fix insecurity, poor infrastructure, or corruption. Yet those same criticisms often reveal another truth. The old order is nervous. For decades, the system was designed so Africa stayed predictable. Export raw materials, import food, repeat the cycle. Now, Burkina Faso dares to break that loop. And human beings, when they attempt something others told them was impossible, often surprise even themselves. There is also the question of timing. Why now? Why in the middle of insecurity and sanctions would a government double down on agriculture? One answer is that crisis clarifies choices. Most Americans understand this instinctively. When bills pile up, families often prioritize food before anything else. In Burkina Faso, that logic scales up from kitchen tables to national policy, and it explains why tractors suddenly matter more than tanks. A short story illustrates the stakes. During the 2011 food crisis, a teacher in Bobo Dioulasso remembered her students arriving to class hungry, unable to focus, some fainting before noon. She said the humiliation of teaching children who could not even lift their heads haunted her for years. When she heard about the India deal, she told reporters, "If these machines mean my students eat before they write, then history has already changed." That testimony captured what no graph could: the intimate link between sovereignty and human dignity. And so the journey loops back to a bigger stage. For India, the tractors are about influence. For the West, they are about lost ground. For Burkina Faso, they are about rewriting its place in the world. But for ordinary citizens, the meaning is simpler: being able to eat from their own fields, to stay rather than leave, to live without bending to someone else's mercy. That is why this story carries weight far beyond economics. It is about the possibility that Africa can finally move from surviving history to shaping it. The applause in Ouagadougou that morning was not the end of the story. It was only the first note in a longer rhythm, one that now echoes through villages, ministries, and foreign capitals alike. And as those echoes spread, the question is no longer whether Burkina Faso can change, but how far that change might reach. It is strange, almost ironic, that a machine designed to plow soil now plows through geopolitics. Burkina Faso's $1.2 billion tractor deal with India is not only about food security or modernization, it is about rewriting the script of sovereignty in West Africa. For decades, headlines painted the country as fragile, dependent, waiting for aid. Now, the same nation is forcing world powers to react, not with handouts, but with strategy. That reversal alone explains why the story matters far beyond the fields. The symbolism is powerful. A landlocked state once dismissed as irrelevant now positions itself at the center of Africa news and West Africa politics. The tractors are physical, but the message is psychological: that dignity can be engineered as much as harvested. And maybe that is why the West seems unsettled. Dependency was predictable, but empowerment is disruptive. For ordinary Burkinabe, this disruption is not theory, it is lived experience. A farmer who once survived on imports may soon sell rice to his neighbors. A young woman who thought of leaving for Europe may stay because she sees a career in agriculture, not just labor in the sun. Human beings, when given real tools, often redraw their choices. Most Americans understand this instinctively. It is like the moment when debt shrinks just enough for a family to start planning a future instead of fearing bills. That psychological freedom is as important as any tractor. Still, the questions remain unresolved. Can a fleet of machines transform a nation scarred by conflict? Can India's partnership truly deliver where Western aid failed? And more importantly, will this model inspire others in the Sahel to abandon the old cycle of dependency? The answers are not guaranteed, but the very fact that these questions are being asked is already a shift. It means Burkina Faso is no longer viewed only through the lens of poverty. It is seen as a test case for sovereignty. A story from a village elder captures this best. He remembered how, during the 1980s drought, his family survived by waiting in line for imported grain. "We ate," he said, "but we ate with shame." Looking at the New Deal, he added, "If my grandchildren eat from our own harvest, they will eat with pride." That contrast, from survival with shame to survival with pride, is what makes this deal more than numbers on paper. It is about reclaiming agency at the most human level. And so the outro is not an ending, but a pivot. Burkina Faso may not yet be a breadbasket, but it has already sown something larger: the idea that Africa can choose its partners, define its priorities, and craft its own future. From here, the next chapters will not be written only in Ouagadougou, but across the Sahel, where leaders and citizens alike are watching to see whether food can indeed become freedom.